Hello and welcome to the photography channel. I'm Nigel Cooper and today I'm talking about filters, which brand I use and why, and which individual filters I use most of the time. And later on I'm going to be going in and around Cambridgeshire to take several shots to demonstrate to you the effects of these filters and how they can improve your images too. Now, filters aren't just for landscape photographers. As I will demonstrate later on, I go to a local Audi dealership to take some photographs of cars in their showroom under artificial light, where filters can greatly improve the image quality. And I also do a portrait shot with a grad filter. I'm going to demonstrate these shots and some traditional landscape shots throughout this video. But first, I just want to say that there are some photographers out there who still don't use filters, many of whom refuse to use them of the belief that they will actually somehow retard the optical quality of their otherwise perfect lenses. And after all, if you just spent £1,500 or £1,600 on a beautiful 24 to 70 f2.8 lens, why would you want to risk doing anything to degrade the quality of that? Now, I'm going to debunk this myth and explain why some people think this. It may be the case with some of the cheap, nasty filters you can buy on the internet, but with the filters I use, if anything, they have the opposite effect. They actually improve the image quality in many ways, including resolution, detail, contrast, and color saturation. And again, I'm going to be demonstrating and showing that a little later in the video. But just sticking with those nasty, cheap brand of filters for a minute, the ones that you can get on eBay and Amazon, we've all seen them, where you can basically buy a set of 3 or 4 grad filters for anywhere between £35 and £50. Now, if you use these filters, yes, they will often have a negative effect on the optical quality of your lenses. And that's because some of these companies just buy in sheets of perspex from wherever they can source it, and they cut those sheets of perspex up into squares and rectangles, and they just spray paint them. So for a start, the optical quality of that perspex is far from perfect, and it can often make your images a trifle soft. And the same goes for the way that they spray paint them. These are not built to last, and they're not optically perfect. Because of the design, that spray paint will clean off if you wash them too many times or clean them too many times, and it can scratch off, and I would steer well clear of them. Now, the filters I use are made by a company called Lee, and it's not a plug for Lee filters. There's no affiliate links in the description below. I use these filters because I think they're the best. Now, admittedly, there's 2 or 3 really good brands of filters that sit quite high up, but for me, Lee is the pick of the bunch for a number of reasons. And firstly, they're made in Hampshire in England, and Lee actually make their own resin in-house. So the quality of their resin and the ingredient that they use is optically perfect. So you're not going to get a better quality resin than that. And these days, the difference in quality between resin filters and glass filters is 0, because the resin that Lee make is that good. In fact, if anything, it's easier for Lee to make a grad filter from resin than it is from glass, because getting that smooth gradation is easier to do with resin. Now, the same applies for the dye that Lee use. It's optically perfect, and the way that they make the filters, rather than it just being spray painted on, once they've made the resin and they've made the sheets of filters, they're actually dipped in the dye. So the dye will actually soak into the filter on both sides, and it actually bites into it and soaks into the resin. So it becomes part of the resin structure rather than just on the surface. So optically speaking, the quality of the resin and the dye is as perfect as it can be. So it does nothing to degrade the image quality. And as you'll see with some of the pictures I take later on, you'll see that they actually improve the image quality. Now, I'm just going to give you a little example of that. For example, a lot of landscape photographers, the ones that really know what they're doing, will often use a grad filter, for example, to bring down the exposure in the sky. Quite often, if you're shooting outdoors, the sky might be 2 stops brighter than the ground, for example. So by putting a graduated filter in, you can bring the exposure of the sky down a couple of stops to match the exposure on the ground. Now, a lot of people may be thinking, well, I can do that in post-production. I can just bracket. I can take 2 or 3 shots and merge them. So, for example, you could take 1 shot and expose for the ground, and then take another shot to expose for the sky. And in post-production, you just mask out the sky of the brighter shot and basically put in the slightly darker image to get a perfectly exposed shot. But the trouble with doing that is, even if you use a soft edge brush, where you've got that line over the horizon, you're going to basically have a soft section where you've blended it. And even if you have a hard edge brush, you're going to be cutting through leaves and foliage and the like. And the chances are the wind would have moved some leaves. So you're going to see leaves that have been sliced in half if you do any kind of pixel peeping. And even with a slightly soft edge brush, you're going to get multiplications of leaves that shouldn't be there. For example, where the wind has blown between shots, and you're going to get parts of leaves that are slightly soft that have been blended over other leaves. You're going to get extra leaves and little bits of softness that shouldn't be there. And for me, that's just not a very good way of doing it. Now, what we've got to remember is, even with modern cameras, they do have a lot of dynamic range. Years ago, you would only have 6 or 7 stops of dynamic range, but modern cameras have got 13, 14, or even 15 stops of dynamic range. However, we have to remember that the human eye has got more than 20 stops of dynamic range. So by using the grad filter in a landscape shot, for example, what we're doing is we're bringing that dynamic range down into a smaller space that the camera's sensor can basically understand and deal with. And this is a better way of doing it than bracketing and taking multiple shots. Now, another way filters can improve the image quality is take the polarizing filter, for example. You've got 2 types. You've got a linear polarizing filter and a circular polarizing filter. And this has got nothing to do with the shape. It's basically to do with the way these filters filter out polarized light. Now, for me, they shouldn't even really be called polarizing filters. If anything, they should be called depolarizing filters, because what they're doing is getting rid of unwanted polarized light. So if you use a circular polarizing filter or a linear one, and the main difference between the two is, if you use a modern camera and you use its metering system or autofocus system, you will want to go for a circular polarizing filter, because that is designed in such a way that it doesn't interfere with those camera functions. However, if you were to try and use a linear filter on a modern DSLR or mirrorless camera, for example, in one of the auto modes with the auto metering system, then it can interfere with that and throw it out. So you would only use a linear polarizing filter if you're using the camera in full manual mode and full manual focus. So just getting back to the circular filter or the linear, if you use that in, say, an outdoor landscape shot, for example, it's going to reduce all that polarized light and get rid of all that haze, which is going to improve definition of the camera. And you're going to retain the megapixel count. So if you've got a 50 megapixel camera, you're possibly going to be throwing away anywhere between 10 and about 30% of that definition by not using filters that are going to filter out that polarized light in many situations. So you're going to retain the full definition and sharpness of the camera. And because you're filtering out the polarized light, another thing that happens is you get rid of all those tiny sparkles and reflections off leaves on trees and foliage. And because they get taken away, you get deeper, richer colors and more saturation. Now, it's not true that when people say you use a polarizing filter, you actually get more saturation and deeper colors, because you don't. What's actually happening is, because the filter is filtering out the polarized light and getting rid of all that haze and reducing all the reflections, you can actually see the colors in their natural form. So they just are deeper and more saturated by definition. So that's just a couple of examples of how using filters will actually improve the quality of your photographs and not retard the image quality of your lens in any way, shape or form. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a quick breakdown of the leaf filter system and what it consists of. So when I'm out and about shooting, you'll have a better understanding as to what I'm doing. So this is the heart of the system right here. This is actually the filter holder. And when it comes out of the box, it's got these edges on it that you can slide 2 filters in. But on the front, you can also clamp on the polarizing filter as well. So you can have 3 filters in total, but it does come with these additional parts. This one here, for example, has got threads in it for 3 filters plus the polarizing filter. So you could have 4 in total if you want to just change those over, and you get them with just individual slots for just 1 filter as well. So we do have many options here. Like I said, it comes with this one for 2 sliding filters and the polarizing filter, because this is what most people are going to be using. Now you need to buy these adapter rings as well, depending on the filter thread of the lens that you're going to be using it with. So this one is an 82mm one, which is screws on the lens, because this Canon 85mm f1.2 lens is quite a large circumference here. But you can get different ones. For example, I've got here a 77 and a 67, and the only thing that changes between them is the actual filter thread size. Other than that, they all fit onto this adapter. So the adapter just simply clamps onto the front. You just slide it across and pull this knob out here on the edge, and then just push it back, and that's it, it's in place. Now this little section here, if you pull it up, so the blue bit is at the top, you can still actually rotate the filter system, or if you turn it and put it to the bottom, it actually locks it off so it won't move. And then when you just turn it to the center, that allows you to pull it out and remove it. So at the top, you can't pull it out, and at the bottom you can't pull it out. So that's basically a good safety mechanism there. So I'm just going to line that up there and put it to the bottom to lock it off so it doesn't turn. And then to put the filters in, this is a grad filter, for example. You would just push it into one of the two slots, either the back one or the front one. And while looking through the viewfinder, you just slide it down into place until that gradation line is lined up with your horizon or wherever you want it to be lined up with. When it comes to the polarizing filter doesn't actually slide into place. It actually just clamps onto the front here like this. You just pop it in and it clamps in there. And then while looking through the viewfinder, you can actually revolve this because it's in two parts whilst watching the effects of the polarized light. Now, let me just remove this for a minute and take these filters off, because what I want to show you now is the Pro lens hood. Because at the end of the day, when you have all this system attached, you can actually use the lens hood that would come with the lens, obviously, because you've got all this in place instead. So you can actually buy one of these. This is like a Bellows Pro lens hood that you can just sort of extend depending on the size of the lens. So if you're using a wide angle lens, a 24mm lens, for example, you would basically push it all the way in like this, or you can just pull it out like that all the way. If you're using like an 85mm or above, for example, or a 50mm lens, you'd have it halfway between the two. And the way this works is this just basically pops onto here like this, and then these bits here just snap across like that, and this one snaps down into place, and that snaps into place like so. There we go. So that is now all held into place on the back of the Pro lens hood. And then as before, we just plonk this onto here like that and pull it out, and that is now in place. And with that in place, you can now pull this out and get it to the area where you want it. Now, the way I do this, when I'm actually setting this up, if I just move around the back here, I will actually pull it out all the way. And then if I'm using a wide angle lens like a 24mm, I actually just put my fingers over the edges, usually around about the first joint. And then with my fingers on the back, I would just pull it back like that, so that I can only see the tips of my fingers in here and not at the first joint. And same for here, you can actually just put your finger on there and just sort of look where your finger is. And if you can see the tip of your finger just, then you'll know that this part of the hood is not going to be in shot. And then as before with the filters, let me just push this back in a little bit so you can see they still go in from behind and slide down like so. And the polarizing filter, again, will still just clamp onto the front here like, well, if we can get that to lock in like that. There we go. And again, it just rotates as normal. So the polarizing filter is on the front, you adjust the hood, and these filters actually just slide into the back. Now, I'm just going to show you one more thing here. So let me just quickly remove this and remove the actual Pro lens hood. Okay, so when you're using filters like this, this is a Lee Super Stopper, and this filter is just a neutral density filter that reduces the amount of light entering the lens by 15 stops on this one. They do a big stopper which reduces the light entering the lens by 10 stops, but on the back of these ones have this little foam gasket around the edge to act as a light sealer. So when you're using these filters, the foam part goes towards the back facing the lens, and you have to put it in to the rear filter slot so that when it gets pushed down like this, it actually seals and it's airtight. So these always have to go in at the back. If you were to put it in at the front one like this, then it's not going to seal and there's going to be a bit of a gap there, and you won't be able to push it down anyway because of the way these are designed. So it's just worth remembering that these always go into the back slot, and when you push it down, you make sure that you've got a nice seal down there all the way around, so that if you're doing like a 4 or 8 minute exposure, no light is going to be able to leak in through that. Okay, so I'm here in St Ives in Cambridgeshire, and I'm going to take a photograph of this rather picturesque scene overlooking the river. I've got the lovely bridge crossing the river with a church in the background, with these kind of Amsterdam-esque buildings down the right-hand side of the river. We've got the church in the background, some lovely cloud formation in the sky, and in the foreground down here we kind of have these green kind of reedy bits coming out, which will give it depth and perspective. Now I'm working at f11 for this shot. The only thing that's going to change throughout these series of shots is the shutter speed, because I want to maintain as much depth of field as possible. So I want to get quite a lot of this scene in focus. So in typical landscape fashion, I focused about 1/3 of the way into the scene, about 20 yards before the bridge in the water, to maintain as much focus as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build this shot up. First, I'm just going to take a blank shot with no filters at all, so we have a baseline of which we can work and use that as a comparison. So I'm just going to first take a shot with nothing, and then I will add a graduated filter just so I can bring the exposure down on the sky to match the rest of the scene, the water in the foreground. And then after that, I'm going to add a polarizing filter which will reduce some reflections on the water and add definition to the clouds in the sky. And then finally, I will add a Lee Big Stopper filter, which will enable me to do a longer exposure of about 4 minutes, which will smooth all the ripples out on the water and give that really eerie kind of dreamlike effect. Okay, so let's just start by taking a blank shot with no filter at all. The camera, for those interested, it's a Sony a7 III, and this is a standard Sony 85mm f1.8 lens. Okay, what I'm using also is a cable release just to make sure I don't get any kind of camera shake at all. Okay, so that's the first picture. That looks really good. Okay, so here's the first photograph. It's nothing spectacular. It's just one of those typical kind of town picture postcard over the river type shots, but we're just going to use this as a base. So this is how the image looks with no filters. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put on this Lee Pro lens hood with the actual adapter ring. So that's going to mean removing the lens hood from there and okay, so that's screwed on there. Okay, so I'm going to go for this graduated filter. Okay, so the filter I'm using here is a Lee 0.9 ND hard. So let me first attach the Pro lens hood. There we go. Right, so I'm just going to look through the lens and pull that down until it comes level with the horizon. And that's looking good. Okay, so that's affected the shutter speed. The shutter speed has now dropped from 1/250th to 1/25th because of that. I'm just going to rotate this to get it lined up. And let's take another shot. Okay, that's made a big difference. So what I'm going to do now, like I said, that grad filter has just brought the exposure down of the sky to get it to match the rest of the scene, so it looks much more balanced. So what I've got to do now is remove the whole assembly here, because what I've got to do now is add the polarizing filter, which is going to mean just temporarily removing that. And the polarizing filter actually clips into the front because it's a circular device. And I do believe Lee filters recommend not trying to do this on the camera, to put this down on a flat surface so you can actually snap this in. There we go. So what I generally do as well, before putting it onto the camera, I generally just give it a turn to basically determine the rotation of the filter. And that's looking really good there, so I can extend the lens hood so it works to its full potential. and pop this back on here, like so. Put the graduated filter back in. Like so. And let's have a look and see what we've got for an exposure now. Okay, we're still at f11, but the shutter speed has now dropped to 1/60th of a second. So let's take a shot. Okay, that's looking really good. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to add a super stopper, which is the 15 stops. Now, when using these filters, they're almost black, so it's important that the camera's in manual focus and you focus first, because once you put this on, you're not really going to be able to see anything. It's got this little foam bit around the edges to seal it, so this filter always goes in at the very back, so it seals nicely. So we're at 1/60th of a second. So what I have to do is, just using the Lee calculator, work out how long that has to be. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly show you what the Lee app is. It's called the Lee Stopper app here on the top right hand side, and essentially it's an exposure guide that calculates what the correct exposure should be depending on which Lee ND filter you're using. So across the top here we've got the 6.1 for the little stopper, the 10.1 for the big stopper, and the 15.1 for the super stopper. So for example, if you're working with the 10 stop big stopper, which basically reduces the amount of light entering the lens by 10 stops, if the regular shutter speed on the camera was, say, 1/60th of a second, when you put the big stopper filter in, you would change that to 15 seconds. With the super stopper, which reduces the amount of light entering the lens by 15 stops, if the regular shutter speed was 1/60th of a second, which is the case here, I would change the shutter speed to 8 minutes by using the bulb feature and setting an 8-minute timer using my cable release. Now this has got a timer built in at the bottom, as you can see here, and it works really well. If I just set this to 15 seconds and hit the timer and hit go, it will count down, and when your 15 seconds are up, an alarm will go off, and then you can then switch off the exposure using the camera's cable release. So that is how that works. So essentially that is how the Lee calculator works. On the left hand side you have your regular shutter speeds, and on the right hand side you've got what it will be. It also works in third increments. So even though there it says 1/60th of a second will become 15 seconds, it tells you here at the bottom. But when you go onto that one, it's telling you at the bottom here that it's 1/80th of a second that changes to 13 seconds. And the next one, 1/100, goes to 10 seconds. And then when we get to here, 1/25th, it's lined up across the middle, telling you what it is. And it also tells you what it is across the bottom. So that's how the Lee calculator works. Okay, so this for this shot, it's going to be 8 minutes according to the Lee calculator. So what I'm going to do is put the camera into manual. I'm still at f11 and I'm in bulb mode, and I've got one of these kitchen timers, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set this to 8 minutes. So I've got that now set to 8 minutes, and using the cable release, this has got like a lever on it, so you can push the button down and slide the lever, which will start the exposure. Okay, which I've now done. So I've now got the exposure rolling and it's counting down from 8 minutes. So in 8 minutes time, let's have a look and see how that one looks. Okay, so the counter is 11 seconds. So I'm just going to get ready to turn this off. It'll 7, 6, 3, 2, okay, let me just have a quick look at that to see how that looks. Yep, that is looking really good. What I'm going to do though, I'm going to do one more, but I'm just going to give it an extra minute. This time I'm going to basically give it 9 minutes. The histogram looks fine, but I just want one maybe a trifle brighter than that. So let me just have a little look at this again, just to double check. Yeah, I'm just going to do one more just for 9 minutes and see how that looks. So here we go. Just get this going again. There we go. So we'll try 9 minutes again this time. And just out of curiosity, what I did for the previous shot, because the sun was behind me, I mean, it's gone behind the cloud now, but for the previous shot over 8 minutes, there was sun streaming down onto the camera. So I actually stood up so that my shadow was falling over the camera in the filter area. I know with the lead big stopper and super stopper filters, they have got the foam around the edges to block any light getting in, so you're totally safe. No light's ever going to get in, but call me old-fashioned. I just like the idea of the shadow from my body falling over that just to be 110%. So let's see how that looks in about 8.5 minutes now. Okay, again, that's made a tiny little bit of a difference. It's just basically up the exposure by a little bit compared to the last one. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pack all this stuff up, get back home, import these raw images into Capture One Pro 20 and have a look, and maybe do a little bit of final post-production tweaking work on that final image to get it to look as good as possible. Okay, so here's that final image I just took, and I think you will agree that that 9-minute exposure has worked wonders on the water. If I just compare it to the previous shot, which had a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second, you can clearly see all the ripples and waves in the water, but when we go to the 9-minute one, it just totally transforms the feel and look of this shot. The other little thing that I did here is I just tweaked the blues in the sky a little bit just to bring those out a little bit more. But basically, there's been a little bit of cloud movement as well. With the previous shot, you can see the definition in the clouds, but when I go to the 9-minute exposure, the clouds obviously did move a little bit during those 9 minutes, hence they're a little bit more blurry with movement. But I just think it adds to the feel. It makes it a little bit more impressionistic, and I quite like that. Same for the swans. If you look at all these swans down this wall, there's normally anywhere between about 15 and 30 swans along this wall. This is in St Ives town centre in Cambridgeshire, and there's always people along here feeding them. Whereas with the 9-minute exposure, all those swans have merely turned into a wash of white foam and you just can't see them at all. I did feel that this shot would lend itself to being cropped because looking at it here, I just felt there was too much green foliage in the foreground that's distracting. So I brought this top section down to get rid of a bit of the sky, but I wanted to keep this tree in, so I didn't want to cut into that. And then down at the bottom, I just brought this up to get that top third line to follow the rule of thirds to sit, just around about the rooftops there, so that I could maintain a bit of the green foliage at the bottom. And for me, this just yields a more pleasing crop because now we can focus on the bridge, the church and the water. However, I didn't like these little floating bits of debris and nonsense here. So what I did was I exported it to Affinity Photo, and using Affinity Photo's rather clever in-painting brush tool, I simply painted all those out. So if you look at before, we've got all the bits of debris floating around here, and then after in Affinity Photo, they're gone. It's basically like the airbrush tool, if you like, in Photoshop. If you don't know what it is, essentially it's just an in-painting brush tool. You paint over something you don't want, and Affinity Photo rather cleverly selects pixels from the surrounding area to in-paint what you've painted out. So if I didn't want this little sign here in the bridge, you can change the size of the brush tool to whatever you want. I'm just going to make it really small here and just paint over this like so. And when I let go, that's it, it's gone because it's replaced it with brickwork from around the outside. If I zoom in a bit more here, this little section here, I can get rid of this. If I didn't want it there, I can just paint over that, and when I let go, pop, it's gone. If I didn't want this little distracting bit of brightness here, again, I can just paint across that, gone. This blue section, whatever that little blue sign is, a quick click, and it's gone. So the in-painting tool is really good in a finished photo. So that's the final image. I think you'll agree, the 9-minute exposure, it just does wonders for the water, and it just looks really nice and surreal. Okay, so today I'm in Cambridgeshire and I'm going to be taking a photograph of this beautiful landscape scene here. We've got this windmill up at the end of this little lane, and we've got all this lush yellow rapeseed. So I thought I would take the opportunity to demonstrate a couple of leaf filters on this shot. The shot I'm going to take is with 2 leaf filters. I'm using a 6ND hard graduated filter, which is just going to bring the sky down about 2 stops. And I've also got a polarizing filter in here that I've adjusted just to help encourage some more yellow out of the rapeseed here. It will just give it a little bit more saturation. I've also got the Lee Pro lens hood because the sun is just over my shoulder here. So I just want to make sure that no sun is going to get into the lens, so that's why I've got the Pro lens hood on as well. So I'm working on aperture priority here. I've got the camera set to just double check my settings. I'm on f4 at 640th of a second. I wanted f4 because I want to throw all the foreground out of focus just a few yards in front of the camera to yield a really good shot. It will just give nice perspective and a little bit of blur in the foreground. So let's take a shot and see how that looks. Okay, that looks super. Okay, so here's the image I just took, and for your reference, I took a shot without any graduated filter or polarizing filter, and as you can see, the sky is a little bit bright and the windmill is actually blending into the sky. You can't actually see too much separation between the windmill and the sky there, but when I put the filter in and the polarizing filter, it just darkens down that sky and brings it all to within the realms of what the camera's dynamic range can deal with. So that doesn't look too good to me, but this just looks so much better. I've got a few more shots in here to show you at the same time. Here we go, I've got 2 here. This is with the grad filter and polarizing filter, and this is without. Again, you can see the sky and how it helps to add separation on the windmill, and without, it's not doing such a great job. Here's another example a little bit closer. This is without and this is with. If you just look at the sky here, it's all bright, and then when I put the grad in and the polarizing filter, it just looks so much better. Here are a few other examples, again with and without. So without any filter at all, using the matrix metering, it's kind of not really underexposing the bushes down here, but maybe the sky is a little bit too bright. But when we apply the ND filter in front of the lens, then it brings that sky down and the matrix meter is exposing for this foreground correctly now. So that's without any filter at all. And then this is with the grad and the polarizing filter. And I decided to crop this because, again, I felt there's too much foliage down here in the foreground. So I cropped it to square, which yields a much more pleasant crop. This was another shot that I took from underneath the windmill. If I just go back to this one and you look here at the sail, you can actually stand under this and reach up and touch it. It's only about 5.5, maybe 6 foot off the ground. So I just love this shot. I went and stood under it and changed the lens to a 24mm lens. And again, I had a polarizing filter on this, no grad, but I just had a polarizing filter to just help bring out that blue sky. Naturally, I brought out the blues a little bit more in post-production as well, but this is the kind of thing you can achieve. And just while I'm in here, here's a few other shots I took also in Cambridgeshire. This, again, you can see the difference quite clearly. No filters there. The sky is very bright, and when we put the ND Grad in, it just darkens down that sky, brings out the blues a little bit more, and it just makes it look more dramatic, I suppose. So that's without, that's a little bit washed out, and then with. It just allows you to concentrate on this log. Again, without, all very bright and overbearing in the sky, and then with, it just brings the exposure down a couple of stops and just brings it all neatly to within what the camera's dynamic range can handle. I know these days cameras have got dynamic ranges that are sort of, 12, 13, 14, maybe even 15 stops of dynamic range. But what the human eye sees and how the camera's sensor deals with this by adding a filter, it just makes it all easier for the camera to pull it all to within its capabilities. Here's another example. This is with no filter, and then this is with the grad and the polarizing filter. So again, we can see the sky's a little bit bright here, and even the log is a little bit as well. But when we put the filter on, it just makes it easier to see the separation between these two horns on this log compared to this one. It just looks so much nicer. Two more quick examples. Again, this is without. We've got all this sort of bright sky, and then when we put the grad filter and polarizing filter on, it just gives it more drama, just makes it more dramatic. Again, that's without, and that's with. Okay, so for this next shot, I was in St. Ives in Cambridgeshire again, taking a photograph over this rather wonderful bridge here. This isn't a river. This was because there'd been a lot of flooding. There's normally cows walking around in this. It's just kind of a field. But I figured while it was flooded, I'd take the opportunity to demonstrate the Lee Big Stopper filter and the Lee Graduated filter. And as usual, I had the Lee Pro Lens Hood, and all this was shot on the Sony a7 III. Okay, so I took a couple of shots while I was in St. Ives. This one's nothing special. I just decided to snap this shot off quickly because there was some nice cloud formation in the sky, and I figured it was a good opportunity to demonstrate the Lee Graduated filter. So if I basically go to the one shot with the filter, you can see that there's a big difference. This is with nothing, and this is with the graduated filter. So when you look at this shot, all the bright sky is dominating the shot. You just can't help but look up into that bright area. But when the filter comes on, it's suddenly like, hello, there's a bridge down here, and there's some grass in the foreground. That now your attention is focused lower down. However, because there's a lot more definition in the sky, as you can see here, you can see the clouds, but with the grad, the clouds are suddenly jumping off the sky a little bit more. The whole sky's been darkened down, and the blues are a bit richer because of that. They're not quite so washed out as it was here. So this is just a prime example of the grad filter bringing down the sky. I basically lined the grad up with just above the bridge here. Now, in the foreground, you could be mistaken for thinking that the grass has suddenly been lit on its own compared to this one. The grass looks a little bit dark, but here it looks nice and bright. This is something that a grad filter can do sometimes, because when you put the grad on, in this shot, I was in aperture priority using the matrix metering or evaluative metering system, which is taking a reading from all over. And because the sky's darker, it's actually brightening up this foreground. Now, I really like it because, again, here it's just all washed out and the foreground is neither here nor there. But with this, because the sky's darker, the metering system is kind of bringing this up a little bit, and it just looks really good. So there's an example of the grad filter on its own. So again, without, no grad filter, with, suddenly it's a much better shot. Now here, this is the main shot I went to take that day. Again, it's nothing special. It's purely for purposes of demonstrating these filters. But this is with no filter at all. We basically have a relatively nice composition. We've got the bridge leading down there to this point. We've got these fence posts leading up, all sort of converging to this sort of area here. Some nice angles. However, your eye is immediately drawn to this bright area of sky and this house here. It's all very bright. But when I put the grad on, it just darkens that sky down. So again, without, with, if I just flick back and forth a few times, you can see here, all the attention is up here, but when we put the graduated filter on, suddenly it's, hello, we have a bridge, and you can see the bridge more. Whereas with this, eye generally goes to the sky, whereas here it's going to the bridge. Now, because this bridge isn't on a perfect horizontal line, a good thing about the Lee filter system is you can just revolve the actual lens hood or the filter system and turn it, which is what I did here with a grad filter. I just turned it clockwise slightly so that the horizontal line of the gradation in the filter was matching the top of this bridge. So again, that's without. And then with the grad filter, it just improves the shot and makes it a bit more pleasing. Now, I decided to put on a big stopper and do a 4-minute exposure because I also felt that all the ripples in the water were too distracting, and when I did that we end up with this. So again, here we've got the distraction of the water, but when we go to this, suddenly we have this more sort of eerie, more pleasing look. So if I just go through the 3 of them again, no filter, grad filter, and then add in on top of that the Lee big stopper. I think it's about a 4-minute exposure I did here. When you've got all the ripples in the water, you don't really notice the bits of debris, but when I do the longer exposure, we have some little bits of debris here. So again, if you weren't happy with these, you could actually just export this and edit it in a different program. I'm just going to really quickly demonstrate what you could do. Whether you got Photoshop or Affinity Photo, it doesn't really make any difference. So if I just jump into Affinity Photo, where this shot is now, again, using Affinity Photo's in-painting brush tool, I could just basically paint over this bit here, for example, that little line there, and then it will do its thing and in-paint it with some pixels from that area. Sometimes it leaves bits behind and you can basically go in and fix those, but if I just sort of draw across a couple of these, you'll get the idea as to what it does. Let me go over that one. There's a little bit more involved here. Hopefully that will work. Yes, it has. What's a little bit left there, and maybe a bit left there. Let me just see, is there a little bit here, something or another that still needs to be dealt with? There we go. I could just click on that one there to get rid of that, for example. And, you know, as you can see, there's just a few bits here that you can just sort of click on. You can click there. I can just sort of draw over that and get rid of that as well. That bit there underneath too. So as you can see already, this is starting to look a lot better if I compare it to the original one with these little bits down here and then go to the Affinity Photo one. So I could basically spend 10 minutes just wiping out some of these other bits as well to end up with a really good shot. So there we go. That's another demonstration of the Lee Grad filter and the big stopper. Okay, so I'm here at Rutland Water, and behind me I've got the famous Normanton Church, and for this shot I'm going to demonstrate using the big stopper. The big stopper reduces the amount of light entering the lens by 10 stops. I've got it set to f14 because I want to have quite a lot in focus, the foreground and the church going into the background, so I don't want it to stop down too much. And I've got a shutter speed of 1/25th of a second. So let me just take a shot so you can see how that will look. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to put on the big stopper, which is the Lee filter that reduces the amount of light by 10 stops. Okay, and what I also need to do for this, there's a Lee calculator, big stopper and super stopper calculator that you can download, and it basically calculates what the time is depending on the filter you have in. So where it is 1/25th of a second, if I look at the big stopper setting, it's telling me that I've got to change that to 8 seconds. So I'm now going to put the camera on to 8 seconds and take another shot. Okay, so here's the first shot that I took. I can't remember the exact shutter speed of this, maybe 1/250th of a second, somewhere around there. And you can see that the water's very choppy. But when I changed the shutter speed to 8 seconds with the Lee stopper filter, it suddenly takes away all that choppiness and we end up with this much smoother looking lake. Again, you can actually go for really long exposures. Some people would do a 2, 4, even 8 or longer, really long exposures. I didn't feel that I needed to achieve it because all I wanted to do here was remove all the choppy water because it was quite windy that day, and by going to this 8-second exposure with the Lee big stopper, it just smooths it all out and yields a more pleasing result from this one because we don't have all the distracting choppiness in the water. While I was there, I also moved the camera and went further away just to get this rock formation in the foreground. And basically, again, very choppy day. It was starting to get quite overcast and dull by now, but I figured I would just sort of take this shot anyway to demonstrate, again, using the big stopper filter. Again, it was about 8 seconds, and as you can see, there's a little boat here. It had moved over to here by the time I went to take this second shot. and it's only moved a little bit during the 8-second exposure, but you can clearly see that going from this to this, we just get this smoother, more surreal look. So this is just another example of something that you can do with the Lee Big Stopper and Super Stopper filters. Okay, for this next shot, I decided to use the Lee Sunset #1 filter, which basically just helps to exaggerate a sunset that's already there, or if there isn't much of a sunset at all, it basically graduates from orange through to kind of yellow and then clear at the bottom. This filter comes in 3 different strengths. It comes in Sunset 1, 2 and 3. So let me show you a few shots that I took using the Sunset #1 filter. Okay, this first shot, which was taken out on the flat plains of Cambridgeshire, nothing spectacular. In fact, this isn't even a lake, it's just a flooded field. But I took this shot just after the sun had gone down. The sun was about here and it's just dipped down below the horizon, so you can't actually see the sun. Although with these sunset filters, it's a good idea also to take photographs while the sun is still in shot, when the sky would be a lot brighter, because then it can add those orange and yellow hues. But I decided to take this one after the sun had already gone down. So there's no filter on this shot and it looks fine. But then if I just basically show you what it looks like with the filter added, it basically just makes it more dramatic and intensifies all the reds. So we've still got light, very light blue sky up here and a little bit of warmer hues down here. But when we add the filter, it just basically gives it a much richer tone and makes it more sunsetty, if you like. So that's without the sunset filter and this is with. Now when I move on to this one, what I actually did here, this is without the sunset filter, but I do have the Lee Big Stopper filter on here to allow me to get a 1-minute exposure. And what that 1-minute exposure is doing, if we compare it to the first shot, you can quite clearly see the clouds, but when I basically add the Big Stopper and go for a 1-minute exposure, the clouds are blurring their way across the sky. So we have gone from that to this. So I just like that effect in the sky. I think it looks all impressionistic and nice. And then when I add the sunset filter to this shot, we get that. So again, still keeping the Big Stopper for the 1-minute exposure, but I've now added the sunset filter. So in this one, as you can see, we've got these light silvery blue areas, but then when I add the sunset filter, they become this sort of dark silvery grey and much more gothic and just a lot more dramatic basically as we go from this without the filter to this, which is with the sunset filter. So this just gives you an idea of the kind of stuff that you can achieve with the Lee sunset filters. Okay, so I've got a few more examples of using the polarizing filter, because polarizing filters aren't just for landscape photographers who want to add definition to the sky and to gain a little bit more saturation in foliage by removing speckles of reflections, etc. They also have their uses indoors. So here I popped along to my local Audi dealership to take a few shots in their showroom of some of their lovely cars. I only wish I could afford one. Anyway, if you're taking a professional product shot of a car in a studio with lots of strobes, etc., then you will definitely need a polarizing filter. Now, polarizing filters come in 2 types. I'm using a circular polarizing filter here, but that's nothing to do with the fact that it's round. You've got linear polarizing filters and circular polarizing filters. They both do the same job, only they do it in a slightly different way. A linear polarizing filter can potentially interfere with the camera's metering system and autofocus system, but if you work in full manual and you work with your focus system in full manual, then a linear polarizing filter does exactly the same thing, and they do come in at a cheaper price. However, if you work in aperture priority or any of the auto modes and use the autofocus system, then the circular polarizing filter is going to be the way to go. So basically, what you do is with this filter, you just dial it in, you turn it and revolve it while looking at the screen on the back of the camera or while looking through the viewfinder, and you just turn it until it gets to the point where all the reflections have disappeared off the car panels and windscreens. Now, because polarized light is basically coming into this showroom from lots of different angles, it's coming in from large windows all around, and there's also the showroom lights above me. You're not going to be able to get rid of all of the reflections because the light's just coming in from so many different angles, but you will be able to get rid of the lion's share of them. The bulk of them you should be able to get rid of. So you just revolve the circular filter while looking through the lens until you get the result that you want. Now, I think actually calling them polarizing filters is a little bit strange. For me, they should be called depolarizing filters, because what they're actually doing is getting rid of the polarized light that you get. And again, you get polarized light outdoors, indoors, and under artificial lighting as well. So I'm still using the Lee Pro lens hood indoors because you get just as much glare and reflection indoors from artificial lights as you do from outdoors. So it's still important to remember that. Okay, so let me just show you a couple of examples that I took. Okay, so I've got 3 car shots here to show you quickly. This is the first one I took. Again, it's not an ideal situation. In an ideal world, I would have had the staff at this dealership move all the cars out of the showroom, park a nice brand new Audi R8 in the middle, and pull down all the blinds on the windows and allow me to bring in 6 or 7 strobes. But I felt that would have been pushing it, so I had to make do. But if you're doing a product shot of a car in a studio that's blacked out and you've got all your strobes, you'll definitely want a polarizing filter, and this will give you some idea as to how it works. So this first shot was taken with no polarizing filter at all, and then when I put the polarizing filter on and dial it in, you can see the difference. There is still admittedly a big reflection across the bonnet, but there's light coming in from the right hand window, the window behind, so there was an awful lot for this polarizing filter to struggle with. If I'd have changed angles, it would have been a slightly different story. But what I want you to just look at here on this shot is the windscreen. This is why I chose this angle. Now, you can't really see through the window that well. Yes, you can see the seats, but with the polarizing filter on, it gets rid of most of the reflections in the window, so it just makes it easier to see through the windscreen to see what's in the car. And also this big glary light here is also drastically reduced when the polarizing filter is put on and dialed in. Similar here on the bonnet. If you look at these lights here in this area, when I put the polarizing filter on, they've just basically been drastically reduced. And also all this blue area on the front of the bonnet here with the polarizing filter on, suddenly, because of all that polarized light being filtered out, the blues are much deeper and much richer. So that's the first example. Let me just go to another one. Slightly different angle here. That's without any filter, and then this is with the polarizing filter. So without and with. So here, if you look on this back door panel here by the handle going across to the front, you have all these streaks of light, and then when the polarizing filter is put on, they practically disappear. Same for the reflections down here in the fold at the bottom of these 2 doors here. No filter, and then with the polarizing filter, they're gone, and it's so much easier to see the paintwork in these panels now. Same here over on the tailgate. If you look on the back of the tailgate here, between the Q5 sign and this Audi sign here, you've got these reflections, and the polarizing filter eliminates those. Same for the tyre. If you look at the tyre here, we have some writing that you can't read too well because we've got reflections. The polarizing filter gets rid of the reflections on the rubber of the tyre, making it a more crushed black and easier to make out these words. So again, that's without and that is with, and I think you'll agree that that is a huge difference. Final shot we have here, this is with the polarizing filter and this is without. So as you can see, there's a big difference here. On this back panel especially, we got all this light and all this sort of light down here, big reflections, and the polarizing filter gets rid of them drastically. So we can now see the paintwork in this back panel, whereas here you can't really because you just have all these ugly reflections everywhere. This just makes the whole thing so much easier to see. And again, down here on the tyre and the wheel, it's made it a nice crushed black there and lost all the reflections off the rubber. So this is with no filter and this is with the polarizing filter. Okay, just while I'm here, I've actually got one more little example of a polarizing filter. This one was basically taken outdoors, and You can see over on the left here, the shutter speed was 1/80th of a second at f11 with no filter. And then when I put the polarizing filter on, it does drop to 1/25th of a second at f11 because we are losing some light because of the polarizing filter. But you can quite clearly see the difference here that first, if you look at the sky, this is without the polarizing filter, and you can see that there's clouds there in the definition, but when I put the filter on, the sky becomes a little bit deeper and it's easier to define the edges of this cloud compared to this one, which is a little bit wishy-washy in this area compared to this. Also, if you look at the grass down here, it's not incredibly vibrant, whereas the polarized version, then suddenly it's just much greener and much brighter. Another thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here, just so I can show you something up here at the top. If you look at these shadows down here, with the polarizing filter, you can suddenly see all the detail in the brick here, and with no filter, we have this harsher shadow. Now you can see the line of the shadow coming down here, and you've still got it with the polarizing filter, so it's still taken literally a few seconds after, but you can see the detail in the brick so much more clearly. And even here where you have these sort of shadow bits, if you look at the polarized one, it just opens it all up and makes it clearer. Same for this tree. If you look at the branches in the tree down here with no filter, with the polarizing filter, then suddenly you can see all the detail in the branches rather than having all these hard shadows everywhere. So again, that's just another example of using the polarizing filter. Okay, this is a perfect example for me to demonstrate using an ND graduated filter during a portrait shoot. Now, we've all seen shots like this of a young lady looking all dreamy and romantic as she looks out of a window. You may have taken shots like this yourself even. The window that you can see there to the right isn't a real window, it is actually fake. It's LED light panel with a net curtain in front of it, but it serves the purpose of what I'm going to demonstrate here. Now, to the left, just behind the model, there's a large reflector panel that's just bouncing a bit of light back in to the model that's coming in through the window. Now, quite often when you take shots like this, when you expose for the model's face, she will be perfectly exposed, but the light coming in through the window might be overexposed. And in this case, all the light behind those net curtains is about 2 stops brighter than the model after I took a reading of the model. So what I'm doing here is I'm using a ND Grad filter to actually just tone down and bring down the exposure of the net curtain. But unlike taking a landscape shot where you would have the filter come in from the top and you would push it down to meet the horizon to bring the exposure down in the sky, as I've turned the camera around into portrait mode, I don't have to revolve the filter holder because just the very nature of turning the camera sideways to take a portrait shot means the filter is now going to be in the right orientation also. So as I push the filter in from the right and slide it across, I've just pushed it in just far enough to cover up the white net curtains to get that exposure from outside to come down by 2 stops to match the exposure of the model. So let me just jump into Capture One and I'll show you a couple of shots taken both with and without the filter so you can see the effects that it had. Okay, so I've got 4 images that I want to show you in here quickly. These are the shots I took of the model in the studio. This one had no ND filter and this one had the ND filter. So what I want you to look at here is this bright light coming in through behind this net curtain. It's seriously overexposed, and if I turn on the exposure warning, you can see all this red area telling us so, whereas the one with the Grad filter, it is all much less so in exposure. The reason we've still got this red sliver here is because in Capture One, I actually like to have my exposure warning set to 250 instead of 255. But as you can see, if I turn it up to 255, that disappears. But at 250, I just find it gives me a little bit of leeway when I'm adjusting my exposure. So if I just turn that off and come back to this shot, if you look at the top here where I'm mousing around, where we've got the red, green and blue and luminance level indicators, as I move the mouse around the picture, they change. So over here, you can see that these white bits, some of these white bits are in fact at 255. Now that doesn't mean they are 255. It simply means that it is over 255. It could be 260, it could be 280, it could be 300. We don't know. We just know that it's over. whereas on this shot in the same area it's around about 246. And just to quantify that, if I take a reading here of this sort of bright area of the model's right arm, we're around about sort of anywhere between sort of 197 to 200 kind of mark. And on this one, again, we're still at that sort of 197 to 200 mark. So you can clearly see that the model has the same exposure in both shots, only the one without the ND filter is washed out and blown out here on the right hand side behind the curtain, whereas on this one, by sliding that ND filter in from the right and lining it up with the edge of her arm and just coming down the side of her body here, it brings all this area of curtain and the window behind it down in exposure a couple of stops to match the rest of the image. So again, this is just all very distracting and too bright, whereas this one, the focus is now on the model. Okay, I've got another example here. You'll have to excuse the rather freaky mannequin on a stick thing, but I recommend all photographers have one of these. This is actually a life-size mannequin head, and I've got it mounted on this microphone stand. The reason for this is because the mic stand is adjustable from about 3.5 feet to 6 feet. So when I'm working in studios with models, I can actually adjust the height of this to get this exactly the same height as the model. And then while she's getting changed or getting into a different outfit, I can basically have this in position and I can be adjusting lights and using this as a stand-in model. This is a really good mannequin head because it's actually got matte skin. It's not a reflective skin. It's kind of like a matte finish, and the eyes are actually glossy, so you can even see catch lights in them. And this is a really fairly decent quality wig, so it has all the right characteristics of a model. So with this shot, again, here's with no ND Grad filter, and here is with an ND Grad filter. So as you can see here, if I just turn on the exposure warning, we've got a few blown out bits in red, whereas on this one, they disappear, while the model or the mannequin head is perfectly exposed. So in this shot, you can see that all this area here is just distracting and a little bit too bright, whereas with the ND Grad, suddenly the focus is on the mannequin here. So that's just another couple of examples of how you can use an ND graduated filter in portraiture when you're shooting a model by a window. Okay, so when it comes to cleaning the filters, be it the resin ones or the glass ones, I'd highly recommend getting one of these Lee filter cleaning kits. They're quite cheap, and it comes with this microfiber cloth and this spray, none of which will do any damage to the filters at all. After all, if you're going to be taking photographs by the sea or landscapes, you're potentially going to get bits of sea spray and dust and grit on the filters, and using one of these kits is just a simple and easy way of cleaning the filters at the end of the shoot, at the end of the day. So that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you could take something away from it. I'm Nigel Cooper. This is a photography channel. Thank you for stopping by, and as usual, I hope to see you again real soon. Bye for now.